This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And we're still experimenting in an era of virus. I thought I would take you today to Australia. Today is the 25th of April, and it's a Memorial Day for Australian and New Zealand armed forces. So created when the Ataturks were in a different era, and Churchill was having Australian troops climb up the cliffs of Gallipoli, and they got popped off by the Turks by the hundreds. And so Turkey is is a memorial for their day too. But I'm old enough that I go back to being a child when World War II was on. And I thought it might be interesting to reminisce a little because Australian troops didn't have the technology that American troops had. And so when I grew up, we had cavalry. I had a 2,000-foot mount on one side. This was part of a plate tectonics on the east side of Australia. And the cavalry was coming down from Dorrigo to Bellingen, and they bivouacked on the bottomlands of the river, which were free because you can't really do agriculture on the river flats. But it was, I can remember it being very intriguing to see hundreds, maybe even thousands of horses coming down. And they were not only recruiting people, they were recruiting horses. And these horses would go to the Middle East along with the soldiers. And they were just there for one night. And I don't know whether they picked up many horses, but they were picking up horses all the way along. The locals volunteered. Some certainly didn't come back. They would arrive back in town for their last rendezvous with people, and everyone would pick up a soldier. They would hitch a ride. I could remember Clyde Brooks riding on the back of a timber jinker that was going back to get more timber. And it was near his home, 8 miles up the river. Little road, dirt road, small post office, house for an engineer that controlled 7 miles of road up the hill. And this was getting to be dangerous time, so he was in charge of proceedings on that road. They had the whole mountain was booby-trapped with explosives. So if the Japanese army were to come from the north and come down that mountain to the coast, the road would be impassable. So this was kind of serious stuff. For a young person, you have to figure out what's going on. There were little things that made you aware that this was a serious war. Some of it went back to World War I. My father had volunteered to be in the army in the teens. He was rejected because he had poor eyesight, and but he was in what they called a VDC, the Voluntary Aid Commission, and that group met together, and they often had their own cavalry. Uh, these days, you can't imagine that in the 1940s we were still fighting with horses. One of my cousins from Sydney came. He was a fire specialist, and he'd been chosen to drive around the state with a buddy, and they were teaching people how to blanket hand grenades. If you didn't get a chance to throw them back, you blanket them so that they wouldn't explode and damage a lot of things. We had 4 foot deep air raid shelters, or they were not shelters. They were just 4 foot deep ditches in the ground, trenches, and they were zigzag. So if the enemy arrived, then there was a place to hide. We gave our bird watching binoculars to the army because they needed them. Just little things that added up to a wartime period. The school children would have little stands here or at the post office or whereabouts to sell lolly water and biscuits to raise money for the war effort. People had ration cards. There was not much petrol to go around, and you could substitute for it by having a gas producer. A gas producer was a very heavy piece of equipment that would be on the back of your car or on the side of your truck, and it ran on partially burned charcoal. So people would have a big pit, and they would put trees in there, dried trees, and cover it up so that they would be burning in an anaerobic manner, and that would retain enough of the carbon to provide water gas, which ran your car. Just little things that remind you of the period. Joan Penny came dressed as a WAC, Women's Army Corps. She had a neat khaki skirt and top and a military hat, and she was coming to visit her parents, and everyone was impressed by the organization. The women were secretaries and support people. They weren't allowed to be on the front, but they were very near the front. There were Wrens that were a Navy support team, and there were nursing groups, and the nurses also got fairly close to the front. The VDC would meet. My father had a 3 feet rifle with a bayonet that could fit on the end of it, make it more like 4 feet, and it was anticipated hand-to-hand fighting. The Australians and the New Zealanders did more of that. This Memorial Day is known as Anzac Day, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. And the traffic was slow. You had ration cards for petrol or gasoline. Some people ran on kerosene. You would find people who didn't use their vehicles very much, and they would give you ration cards. My sister still has some of these ration cards. You had ration cards for food. We, my father was a one-teacher school teacher, but as a one-teacher school teacher in a very small village, you get to be the leader of voting behavior and things like that. So he was a leader in the war effort too. Children especially, were evacuated from Sydney because Sydney was endangered. It was like 360 miles away. But I can remember being in the little Protestant church that we had. It was Presbyterian and Methodist shared it. And Prue Beattie was watching out behind the parson's stand. There was an open door, and this little church didn't have any air conditioning. So Prue Beattie saw what she thought was a Japanese person walking by the back of the church. So everything stopped, and the congregation got out, and they went looking for this person. The person was walking fairly fast, so they didn't find out who it was or what it was, but it turned out a few days later we found out that this was an evacuee child from the city who was in an era when you greased your hair, so he had slick black hair and a low profile that looked more like a Japanese person. So that was solved. He was staying with his uncle, and the uncle ran a farm very efficiently, and this guy was just walking around. So as the war went on, there were elements that you would remember. The bus driver would limp because he had been received shrapnel in a hip. Even some people, when we went on vacation to the beach, we rented a house next to someone who had been gassed in World War I, and he could hardly breathe, and he was very lucky to be alive. So you have to think about these conflicts, whether it be Gallipoli or France or the Middle East. Some were more modern than others. The coastal people who were fisher persons had a problem well before the war. The Japanese would come down and they would invade their lobster pots and fishing grounds. So some of the communities that were on the coast would be out there with small boats, but they would be armed to protect their fishing. The Japanese are still doing that. They're still harvesting endangered whales for food. That was part of the problem for Japan, was that it didn't have enough food. There is a growth pattern. There's a limit to growth, and if you have a small country with not very much arable land, then you have to depend on the oceans or other countries. And they had been in Manchuria. It was taking over from China, and they were moving around, and they'd been in Hawaii with quite a spectacular death toll there, and that brought the U.S. into the war. But it was a time of concern. We had a railroad that came to near us. It was on the coast. It was 20 miles away, but it ran infrequently, so it was always crowded to standing room only. But when the military had to deal with Italian prisoners of war, and so if they had two cars of Italian prisoners, they had room to move, and so there were little spats about who got to have some room to move on the train going up the coast of New South Wales. Some of those prisoners worked for farmers. Some of them worked on roads like Mountain Road that was 7 miles up the 2,000-foot mountain that I lived in. There would be teams. Some of them got to be quite friendly, and after the war, they came back with their families and immigrated to Australia. Just a little strange. It was a friendly part of the World War activities. There were flags, and I meant to say that on that train situation, we had a very staunch conductor. He played by the rules, and if the Italians were being given room just to keep control of things, and he was going to obey that. And I can remember the day when they some of the troops and locals that were traveling on these trains took that conductor and hung him out upside down outside the train to teach him a lesson or two. And I don't know whether that freed up things, but there was a little conflict here. The soldiers were often traveling to and from leave by hitchhiking and being on trains, and so everyone gave them room. The trains didn't always run on time. I can remember going to school by train, and we would have to wait sometimes hours before the train came in. We would learn how to play cards and whatnot. In Sydney, it was pretty serious stuff. My relatives lived at Bondi. Bondi is famous for being a beach. It is on a narrow neck that separates Sydney Harbour from the open sea. There's two headlands, and the Japanese were right there, and they fired a couple of missiles almost right across my grandparents' home and landed in the harbour. The Australians were ready for this. They had a grid across the harbour entrance, but so were the Japanese. They had miniature submarines that took two men, and the submarine had a saw on it, so it could break through the barricade that was built under the harbour, and would allow them to access the more commercial and industrial parts of Sydney. The army at that time was very interested in clairvoyance. They had discovered that one man in particular could stand on the heads and tell them where all the Japanese ships were. And he was remarkably accurate. And to this day, the researchers don't know how he did that or how animals do it. When animals move in unison, they seem to have some communication that is above and beyond what we normally have. So the army was looking for people who might be able to taste exceptionally well, or hear exceptionally well, or be able to be clairvoyant. I'm trying to think of other things that would help you understand what it was like to grow up in that situation. My father's avocation and my assistants and my brother's assistants as young folk, we made toys because toys were not readily available, and we also made ladders and wheelbarrows that were needed and what were in short supply. We would go to town on Friday night. We always wore no shoes, but to go to town you had to wear sandals. But we would last about 1 hour with the sandals, and it would be getting blisters that we didn't want. So we would sit down and we would listen to the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army had tremendous respect because in Gallipoli and places like that, they worked the no man's land. They picked up the wounded and dead bodies and brought them in. And even in the most dangerous situations, someone in the Salvation Army can walk in there and receive respect. We made butter. We had 6 or 7 cows. They would live on a community grounds, common grounds, and at night they would sleep under the coral trees. Coral trees have a red flower, so that's the coral name. And I would go to wake up my cows in the morning, and I would sit down and lean up against them as they slept, and then they would get up and come in to be milked. So it was the milk that gave us enough butter to sell, eggs. We didn't have hogs, but we certainly had acres of vegetables and fruit trees, and we could share them with people who were less well off. There were happy sides to this. The American GIs would come for rest and resuscitation to Australia from the Pacific areas, and sometimes they would pick up women who were very willing to chaperone them, and many of those women married GIs. My wife has a cousin in Chicago. She lived at a place called Cabramatta, which was not too far from Warwick Farm, where her future husband, Duffin, was a quartermaster storeman. And when she came to the US to marry him, there were 400 women on the ship that was a modified steamer making a special trip. So we know those families now. They're both mother and father have passed, but the children have done very well, and they're Chicago based. I think that gives you a rough idea of what it was like to be growing up at a time when there was not only a Japanese war, but there was a war in Europe, and it goes right back to the time when Australian troops were holed up in Europe for months and months at a time, and gas was being used, and so there are poems about people who are buried in Flanders Field. in Flanders field the poppies grow. And on Anzac Day, people will sell stylized poppies, little red poppy that is a memorial. The Australian tends to be willing to use technology if you can get it. After World War II, I worked for a Pearson company in Sydney while I was going to university, and they would go up to the islands, and when the war was finished, many of the pieces of equipment were left. Sometimes they were in the ocean, but the Australians, being who they are, basically started out as convicts that could no longer come to the US. They know how to survive, and the company I worked with was salvaging trucks, and we would have to take the engine out and rebore the engine and put larger rings in the engine and put them back together. And Australia has drives on a different side of the road, so you always had to have a rig so that the driver that was seated in a vehicle that was designed for a different road would be able to indicate to someone that he was going to turn or whatever. So these trucks for years became part of Australians' workforce. As a student in agriculture, we had to get rural experience or agricultural experience equivalent to about a year while we were going through 4 years of university. And at one stage I went wheat carting, and the truck that was being used had something like 14 gears, some on the transmission to the engine, some on the tail shaft at the back, and they could take a huge load. So they were designed to carry tanks. And in our case, the little elevators that were not used to such big pieces of equipment had to take oxy welding machines and widen the races where we would dump grain. I can remember working on that sort of situation at night. We would use the headlights of one truck to light up the bagger. So in those days, we didn't have bulk loading. You bagged your grain and you put it on a kicker. You dropped it on a hydraulic hoist that came up to your shoulder level. You took that 3.5 bushels of grain and you dumped it on the truck. You had to keep careful that you put it in the right place because you could never really lift that amount of grain again. And it was important that you loaded the right way so that the truck didn't unload its load as it went around the bend. We had one of these trucks, I think it had 114 bags of grain on it. Huge truck. Multiple wheels at the back. So after the war, there were still a lot of war reparation things. The New Guinea was still a fairly primitive land, very forested, very tribal. The Australian troops, and I think other troops too, were very respectful of the Fuzzy Wuzzies. The Fuzzy Voices were helpful. They had a different language. They didn't know about planes. Planes would drop them food that they had never encountered before, and it was known as a cargo cult. This was the cult of the people who got to be used to food materials being dropped. Gradually, those New Guinea people got to develop their own countries and were no longer supervised by Australia. But for a long time, these were protected areas that were protected and managed by Australia. New Zealand would do the same. Australia and New Zealand are a little different. Australia is not rich in terms of soil. New Zealand is rich in terms of soil. It had oceanic natives, Maoris, that could trade in potatoes and things like that long before there were any Caucasian settlers in New Zealand. They were different from the Australian native, who is a Stone Age person and knew how to survive in desert situations, especially when Caucasian people took over the arable land on the East Coast, a small amount of arable land. They were past masters at knowing nature. The Caucasian, especially police force, would use the black Aboriginals as people to track. If the Aboriginal was so astute at noticing whether little branches or footprints were changed, they were exceptional trackers. Very intelligent people, but Stone Age people. They had no resistance to diseases like measles and mumps and chickenpox, and they died massively because of that. They had no concept of ownership. If a cow was introduced to Tasmania, it was an animal that could be captured for food. It was roaming on territory which theoretically belonged to the Aboriginals. And then the Aboriginals would lose lives because of that conflict. But I grew up with football teams where Aboriginals played on the football teams, and they were almost tribal in their manner. They could, the casino tribes would be different from the tribes further down the coast, but they played fair, and they were citizens of note that had adapted to a changing environment in the 80s and 90s. So I could remember Andy Boney was a very respected local Aboriginal. They would still hunt in a native manner. If we went to town, sometimes we would encounter a group of Aboriginals that were hunting snakes, but they didn't want to have a snake given to them by you. They wanted to know that the snake had not bitten itself or anything like that, but they would hunt in a native manner. And part of that was probably because they weren't as accepted as you might think. Early settled to Australia were convict people who hadn't done much other than be in England when dukes and lords wanted landscape space, and that forced them into cities where they had no housing and no income. And if you stole a loaf of bread, you might be hung or sent to prison in England, or if you were lucky, you would be sent to develop the colonies. So the army would supervise arriving convicts, and they had little knowledge of how to grow things or to how to harvest from the landscape. So the Aboriginals, being very communistic in their style, would teach the invaders how to survive. And it was a thank you to the Aboriginals in the vicinity of Sydney and its environments where the early settlement was, that they survived because of the Aboriginals. But then the Aboriginals began to get smart. They just realized that their territories were being taken over, and they were being castigated if they harvested corn that they had helped to grow. It might be a Caucasian plot, but they would feel like they could help themselves, and that conflict was difficult. The early settlements were on coastal plains, and then behind the coastal plain there was this escarpment of up to about 2,000 feet that was very hard to get up on, and so railroads would go up the front of the escarpment and onto the top of the escarpment. And you have to know that the plate, the earthly plate that the Aboriginals knew and named Gonwalla, it's Gonwinder. I've got it wrong, but the Aboriginals have a name for it. And they could survive in it, but it was basically shales and slates and sandstones and soils that were very poor and leached because they'd been under the ocean. You could see the current bedding in the but the trees, the eucalyptus trees that took over could be very gnarled, and every once in a while this plate tectonics, of course, gave some movement of volcanism, and you would have tropical rainforest on, it was called an edaphic soil. It was a soil based on basalt that was coming through from underneath. So you had these outliers, and that's where early settlers were. And so it's in a little bit past that time where you started to have a war effort, and Australian as part of colonies to England. England was the motherland. So if England was in difficulties in World War I and World War II, they were prepared to support the British Empire, an empire which around the world the sun never set on. You could always find a place that was an English colony with sun on it. That is very different these days, but some of these rather big movements have had tremendous effect on what we have as a world. You have people coming from paganism. You go back even further than that to Audubon Gorge, where we had early humans, and they sort of moved north through Africa into Europe, across Asia, and down to Australia. We keep finding out interesting things about the movement of populations. Some of them went up through Alaska and down into the US, and became the tribal people in North and South America. They were pagans, but then there got to be organized groups. There were the gradual establishment of Jewish people, Catholic people. You had a conflict between different groups, different religions, and different leaders. And sometimes they were overlapping to a considerable amount, but they had their own territories, and they could be all a part of living conflict. The Spaniards got rid of people that were not Catholic. All the way up to Russia. So Europe has always been full of conflict and still is. Just little things like the Brexit, which is the United European situation where Britain is moving away from the European scene. And so now you have population limitations. There's a limit on growth. There's a limit of how much steel there is in the soil, how much iron, how much chromiums, how much lead, and you can document how much is already being used, how much is likely to be used, how much might be still in the soil. We may not have found everything, but different countries have different resources. Some of them have oil. At the moment, you're looking at oil being in reasonable excess because there's been a gentle move to go away from non-renewable resources. So you have populations that have used children as their workforce. And many of those children died. And the gross national product has gone up and medicine has come in. And many of the children that died and gave an average lifespan of 30 years, more like 40 and 50 years. And at the same time, these people decided that they could use chromium, they could use molybdenum. Sometimes it's in very little amounts, but these elements are very rare. And so you have to have a balance between the number of people and the number of people who die. If they're going to live longer, and some industrial countries are living into with an average survival of perhaps overall of 50 or so years, but that could be in individual places up 75 years. My father was the 14th child, and most all of the brothers and sisters survived, and they had fairly large families. So the world's population has increased exponentially. And can we keep that going? Are there resources out there? Is there enough copper to provide for the sophisticated instruments we need? So economists are doing their best to estimate. It's not something you can say there's a formal amount of this and so. It's affected by lots of changing situations. It may be changing the society. The society is going from a rural society with not much needs to an industrial society that does need needs. And there is a balance between the haves and the have-nots. And if the have-nots are going to die in their habitat, they're going to move and immigrate. And so you see at the moment a lot of movement from African societies to and Asian societies to other countries that have better resources. But then some of those other countries are dependent on resources. You have to think about sustainability. You have to think about recycling. And we don't do very much of that. If some element is in short supply, it may be that you have to think about recycling it. But as you recycle, as things get smaller, it gets more costly to recycle. For instance, computers used to have little spots of gold and platinum and rare metals that could be harvested relatively easily. So there were people who would pick up your computer and harvest it, and it would pay. But now that there's an economy, so it got to the point where there's very little of that. The chips have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. But how small can we get before we lose out? Is there a definite limit? And what do you do when you come to the end of that limit? Do you substitute a new metal for another metal, plastic? Do you go to the oceans for water because water becomes important? Do we in the Midwest sell water to Los Angeles? Or do you desalinate ocean water? The desalination is costly. So you have to think about these things. I would like to see more time for education, and I think that's what young folk are clamoring for, is to have more knowledge about what they're using, what they're eating, what they're. I picked up tomato juice. But that tomato juice was heavily laced by salt. Some foods are laced by sugar. If you go back 100 years, or you go back even further than that, when you had windjammers, if you're going to take butter to England, you had to salt it it was a preservative. And people got to have diets that enjoyed saltiness. It improved the flavor of things. But then industry has gotten to feel that if one spoonful of salt is good, then two spoonfuls of salt is better. And that ain't so. If you have copper and zinc and magnesium and molybdenum, the very smallest amount is very essential. But if you put in a larger amount, then you're going to put in a poison. So we have to have that sort of sophistication. We can't just have people who eat potatoes and don't know exactly what they're eating. We need to have more education, and education doesn't always do it, but it does help people to understand themselves and the industries around them. They also have to think about living with pollution. And this virus that's around us now is remarkable. It is indicating that we can exist with less energy, and pollution is improved remarkably by the retention of industry. So we have to think about how we manipulate what elements we have remaining in the landscape. So when you go out there and look at a prairie plant, you have to know that it has a zillion chemicals in it and enzymes, and you know that this is very good soil brought down by glaciation. You know it's worthwhile, and you can take it over. But in the last 50 years, I've watched very small remaining pieces of prairie just disappear. So within the next generation, we're going to lose probably half of our biological species. It's because we don't understand that they have to live too, and that we can't just walk in and take over their landscape. So climate change and other considerations are serious matters. And if we don't pay attention, humans will be so numerous and the ecology so small that extinction will eventuate. There are people looking for planets that might be like our own, but they're very few and far between if they're there at all. But if we don't think about what we're doing in this Earth Week, the human race might be in bad shape. So meetings and concern amongst young people are important. Today I will be on camera with electronic devices which have been tremendously helpful to us, where you can have 5 or 6 people, in this case will be young people, who are learning from the internet. And so we have to applaud the internet and what it does. I've got about 5 minutes left, but I think we have to give WEFT a great deal of credit for what they do. And theoretically, I'm supposed to make an announcement every half hour. And I don't always do that because I'm not clever enough to finish this conversation and break and then come back in again. So I'm going to leave about 5 minutes for WEFT announcements, and I hope that you will think more about the environment. Think about peace. Think about living with each other. And I'm inordinately grateful for having been able to work here in this Midwest situation and do things that I think should be done. And I really have to say thank you to this country for doing that, allowing that to be my career. So with that, I think I'm going to say thank you. It's Earth Week, it's Easter, it's Ramada, it's uh, virus, and it's really a complicated world. See what we can do with it. Uh, Lots of love and a hug out there. See what you can do. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.